20% of the world's oil passes through a strait you could swim across in under an hour. That's not a metaphor. That's the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles at its narrowest point, and right now, the most powerful military in human history cannot secure it. Not because the weapons are failing, because the war itself is illegal, and everyone in Washington knows it. The media will show you the missile intercepts, the drone footage, the admirals at press conferences with laser pointers and confidence. But here's what no one is telling you. The President of the United States has been conducting a war for over 60 days without a single vote from Congress authorizing it. That's not a technicality. That is the specific scenario the United States Congress wrote a law in 1973 to prevent from ever happening again. And it's happening again. The mechanism that's being hidden from you isn't a military one, it's a constitutional one. And it changes everything about how this ends. Ask yourself this: if the war were going well, why would the president spend every day telling you it's almost over? Here's the number that explains the entire situation. 60. That's the maximum number of days under the War Powers Act of 1973 that a president can conduct military operations without congressional authorization. The law is explicit. After 60 days, without a declaration of war or a specific authorization from Congress, the operation becomes illegal under American law. The source isn't an opposition talking point. It's the statute itself, passed by a bipartisan Congress, signed into law over a presidential veto, precisely because legislators had watched two presidents, one Democrat, one Republican, turn a minor naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin into 19 years and 58,000 American dead. What does that number mean concretely? It means that every military order issued after day 60 has no legal foundation. Every pilot who takes off, every ship captain who fires, every soldier deployed, they are operating under commands that are by the letter of American law unauthorized. The second implication is deeper. It means that any deal, any ceasefire, any negotiated outcome reached by this president without congressional backing can be dismantled the moment he leaves office. There's no legal architecture holding it up. This statistic is ignored because it destroys the narrative of decisive executive leadership. The moment you acknowledge the War Powers Act, you have to ask whether the commander-in-chief is a wartime president or a lawbreaker, and that question has no comfortable answer. To understand how America arrived here, you need a specific piece of history that gets dropped from most coverage. In August 1964, President Lyndon Johnson told Congress that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Congress passed a resolution authorizing military force within hours. Both chambers voted the same day. The House vote was unanimous. Only 2 senators dissented. Here is what Johnson did not tell Congress. The attack, such as it was, had been wildly exaggerated. A minor naval encounter in poor visibility and rough seas was presented as a deliberate, repeated act of aggression against American forces. Congress thought it was authorizing a limited response. What it had actually done was hand a president a blank check with no expiration date. 4 years later, there were 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. Richard Nixon, who inherited the war, expanded it into neighboring countries without additional authorization. By 1973, members of Congress who had voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution were trying by any means available to cut off funding for a war they felt they had been deceived into approving. The War Powers Act was their answer, not a perfect answer. Presidents have treated it with contempt ever since, but it exists. It is law, and 60 days is not a suggestion. The parallel to the present isn't decorative. The structure is identical. A president describes an adversary's actions in the most alarming possible terms. Congress and the public, primed for confrontation, support the initial response. The operation stretches beyond what was originally implied, and then somewhere around week 8 or 9, someone checks the calendar. Think of it this way. Imagine you hire a contractor to fix a leaking pipe. You give him access to your house for 2 weeks. 6 weeks later, he's still there. He's knocked out 2 walls, redirected your plumbing, and started work on the foundation. Every time you ask when he'll be done, he says soon. It's tricky. You don't understand how bad the leak was. When you point out that his contract expired a month ago, he looks at you like you've said something unreasonable. The leaking pipe is the initial military threat. The contractor is the executive branch. The contract is the War Powers Act. The two walls he knocked out are the international relationships and legal frameworks collapsing in the background while everyone watches the renovation. And the foundation he started digging into, that's the constitutional order itself. Subscribe now if you want to understand these dynamics in real time. This kind of conflict moves fast, and so does this channel. Here's what most analysts say is happening. The United States is engaged in a limited military campaign to degrade Iran's capacity to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, with the goal of forcing a negotiation that produces a new agreement on nuclear and regional security. That's the surface explanation. It sounds coherent. It is incomplete in ways that matter. The first structural problem is this. A military operation without legal authorization cannot produce a durable diplomatic outcome. Iran's government, whatever its other qualities, has lawyers. Any agreement reached with a president who is by his own country's law operating outside his authority is an agreement that can be walked back by the next administration, challenged in court, or simply ignored. The legal instability of the war is also the legal instability of any peace. The second layer is harder to see, but more important. The dominant power in a situation like this faces a particular trap. The more force it applies, the more it demonstrates that negotiation has failed, which raises the domestic political cost of any deal that looks like less than total victory. The challenger, in this case Iran, has a rational interest in surviving long enough for that dynamic to play out. Every week of stalemate is a week in which the legal clock runs, domestic support erodes, and the contradictions in the dominant power's position become more visible. The challenger doesn't need to win militarily. It needs to outlast the political coherence of the opposition. This is not a novel strategy. It is the reason that military operations which begin without clear political objectives tend not to end on the initiating party's terms. Picture a war room somewhere in the Gulf, not the American one. The other side, the people in that room are not reading military assessments. They're reading American polling numbers. They're reading the congressional calendar. They're watching a president who one day says he might be better off not making a deal and the next day denies he ever said it. They are watching an adversary whose most dangerous weapon, legal, political, and institutional coherence, is visibly degrading in real time. The closing line in that room isn't triumphant. It's quiet. It's something like, we don't have to beat them, we just have to wait. Now picture Washington, not the press briefing, the private calculation. A White House that knows the war powers clock has expired. A Congress controlled by a party that does not want to hand the opposition a political crisis, but also does not want to cast a vote authorizing a war it didn't design and can't control. The incentive for every legislator is to do nothing, to let the president own this, to wait. The problem is that waiting in this case is a choice, and it is a choice with consequences. The media frames this as a story about missiles and negotiations, about whether Iran will come to the table, about whether the Gulf states will hold together, about what happens at the Strait of Hormuz on any given Tuesday. What is actually happening is a constitutional stress test. The War Powers Act is either law or it isn't. If a president can conduct military operations indefinitely by refusing to call them a war, by calling them an excursion, a little detour, a mini-war, then the 60-day limit is not a law. It's a suggestion. And if it's a suggestion, then Congress has no meaningful role in the decision to go to war, which means the founders' design, which placed that decision in the legislature precisely because they feared executive overreach, has been quietly dissolved. The historical lesson that applies here is not Vietnam. It is the period after Vietnam, when Congress passed the War Powers Act, believing it had finally closed the door on unilateral presidential war-making. Every president since has tested that door. Some have knocked, some have leaned on it. This one appears to be sitting on the floor in front of it, eating lunch and insisting there is no door. And what no one is saying clearly enough is that if Congress does not act in either direction, authorization or termination, it will have established a precedent that the War Powers Act does not actually constrain anything. That precedent will be available to every future president. of any party forever. 2 years from now, if current trends hold, you will be watching a legal and political reckoning that makes this moment look calm. The question of whether this war was authorized will move from congressional debates into courts, into election campaigns, into the historical record. Allies who are asked to support operations of dubious legal standing will have drawn their own conclusions about what American commitments mean. In 5 years, the structure of how the United States enters conflicts will have been fundamentally altered one way or another. Either Congress will have reasserted the War Powers Act in a form with actual enforcement mechanisms, or the act will have been functionally nullified by non-use. There is no middle path that leaves things as they were. In 10 years, historians will look at this period the way we now look at the Gulf of Tonkin, not as a military story, but as a story about institutional failure, about a legislature that knew the rules were being broken and found it more convenient to watch than to act, about a public that was shown missiles and drones and never told about the 60-day clock until the clock had already run out. Here is the number I've kept for last: 2. That was the number of senators who voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. 2 out of 100. The rest voted for it the same day they heard about it, based on information that was exaggerated in a context they did not fully understand, because the political cost of being seen as soft on a threat felt higher than the cost of being wrong. That number is the entire argument. Not because history repeats itself, it doesn't, not exactly, but because institutions do not protect themselves. People protect them. And the question of whether 2 is still the operative number or whether it has grown is not a question about Iran or the Strait of Hormuz or even this president. It is a question about what you think the rule of law is for. The 21st century will not be won with the most missiles. It will be won by the societies that can still make binding decisions and live by them. Somewhere in the Strait of Hormuz tonight, a Navy ship is on watch. The crew is following orders. The orders came from a chain of command. The chain of command leads back to a law that expired 2 weeks ago. That ship is doing its job. The question is whether anyone else is doing theirs.